I wasn't searching for lost civilizations. I wasn't investigating erased empires or suppressed histories. I was studying marble, classical sculpture techniques, Renaissance methods, the discipline of hammer and chisel, the predictable resistance of stone. Marble fractures along veins. It splinters when worked too thin. Push too far and it fails. Every sculptor knows this. Every mason learns it early. Stone has limits. And then I saw something that did not behave like stone. Inside the San Severo Chapel in Naples stands the Veiled Christ, attributed to Giuseppe Sammartino in 1753. A full-body marble sculpture of Christ beneath a shroud so thin it appears translucent when light grazes across it. The veil does not simply resemble fabric. It drapes like fabric. It gathers. It clings. It reveals the contours of the face beneath it as if damp linen had been pressed against skin. We are told this is a pinnacle of craftsmanship, a master sculptor working from a single block of marble. Patient, precise, extraordinary. But marble does not ripple like silk. The thinnest sections of that veil appear scarcely thicker than a few millimeters. Marble at that thickness should fracture. It should chip. It should disintegrate under its own brittleness. And yet it survives, intact for nearly 3 centuries. Skill explains refinement. Skill does not eliminate physics. When I began looking more closely, I discovered that Naples was not unique. Similar veiled sculptures appear across Europe within the same narrow window of time, the early to mid-18th century. Works attributed to Antonio Corradini and his circle, the veiled Vestal Virgin, the veiled Rebecca, the Modesty, different cities, different patrons, the same impossibility, the same translucence, the same fabric-like softness rendered in stone. The official explanation remains consistent: masterful artistry, generations of accumulated skill, the natural evolution of technique. But when you examine the timeline, something strange emerges. The method does not gradually develop. There are no crude early attempts, no transitional experiments where the veil is thicker, less convincing, more obviously carved. The earliest surviving examples are already fully realized. The technique appears perfected. It flourishes for roughly 50 years. Then it disappears. No manuals describing the process. No technical breakdowns. No preserved apprenticeships documenting how to achieve such extreme thinness without catastrophic failure. By the early 19th century, the method is effectively gone. Modern sculptors, equipped with diamond bits, rotary tools, and computer-guided carving, can approximate the effect, but their results are thicker, mechanically evident. The illusion is impressive, but the originals remain more delicate. How does an 18th century sculptor using hand tools exceed the capabilities of 21st century technology? Coincidence remains possible. Exceptional genius remains possible. But repetition alters probability, and the veils are only the beginning. Part 2. The Global Signature. When I expanded the scope beyond sculpture, the pattern deepened. Consider Sacsayhuaman in Peru. Massive polygonal stones interlock with tolerances so precise that even today, a sheet of paper cannot slide between blocks. Some weigh over 100 tons. The official explanation describes harder stones used to pound softer ones into shape. Yet when examined closely, percussion marks are minimal. The surfaces appear smooth, almost mold. In Egypt, red granite blocks, some exceeding 100 tons, are cut and aligned with precision that challenges modern replication. Copper chisels and dolerite pounders are cited as tools, but granite is harder than copper, and the cuts, in many cases, appear cleaner than expected from percussion alone. In Turkey, at Göbekli Tepe, T-shaped limestone pillars dated to approximately 9,600 BC display smooth surfaces and intricate relief carvings, thousands of years before the widespread adoption of metal tools. Different continents, different cultures, vastly separated in time. The explanations vary. The physical signature sometimes does not. Smooth surfaces, organic curves, precision fits, a suggestion, not proof, of material behavior that differs from simple hammer and chisel carving. Then the 19th century arrives. Between roughly 1880 and 1920, cities across Europe and North America experience an architectural explosion. Madrid, Chicago, Philadelphia, Budapest, Prague, New York, Grand civic buildings rise with elaborate stone facades, ornate terracotta ornamentation, and organic flowing forms that seem frozen mid-motion. Identical decorative flourishes appear in multiple locations with millimetric precision. Continuous patterns wrap corners seamlessly. Undercuts exist where surrounding material appears untouched. We are told this is simply craftsmanship at its peak. The Beaux-Arts movement, neoclassical revival, architectural fashion spreading globally. Perhaps, but the repetition feels coordinated. And then, just as abruptly as it appears, it begins to vanish. Many of the most elaborate buildings from that era are demolished within decades. The Singer Building in New York, completed in 1908, demolished in 1968. The original Pennsylvania station, completed in 1910, demolished in 1963. Countless others labeled obsolete. Obsolete despite durability. Obsolete despite aesthetic superiority. The justification is economic, but the loss is architectural. Meanwhile, cities burn. Moscow in 1812. Chicago in 1871. San Francisco in 1906. Records vanish in flames. Libraries disappear. Archives are reduced to ash. What often survives are the buildings themselves, the stone evidence, but not the documentation explaining how they were made. This is not proof of suppression, but it is a pattern of absence. And absence, when repeated, becomes difficult to ignore. Part 3. The name that disappeared. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, maps consistently labeled vast regions of northern Asia as Tartaria or Tartaria. French maps, British maps, Russian maps, a shared nomenclature across geopolitical rivals. Then, gradually, the name fades. The territories are relabeled under modern nation-states. Cartography evolves. Political realities shift. That alone proves nothing extraordinary. Names change. Empires reorganize. But when viewed alongside the architectural anomalies, the synchronized emergence of advanced stone techniques, and the abrupt disappearance of certain methods, the term Tartaria begins to function less as a defined empire and more as a placeholder, a label for a period whose material capabilities appear greater than our narrative comfortably explains. Consider the possibility, not certainty, not accusation, that some form of material science existed in the 18th century that allowed temporary alteration of stone properties. Alchemical texts from earlier periods describe processes for rendering stone pliable. These references are often dismissed as metaphorical or pre-scientific misunderstanding. Yet during the early 19th century, educational systems undergo standardization. Alchemy is purged from curricula. Libraries reorganize. Texts categorized as pre-scientific are archived or discarded. Modern chemistry emerges, and references to stones softening quietly fade from serious academic consideration. Again, this does not prove suppression. It demonstrates transition. But the timing aligns curiously with the disappearance of the veiled sculpture technique. If such knowledge existed, whether chemical, mechanical, or procedural, it could have been lost through institutional reform, war, economic collapse, or simple disinterest. Or it could have been deemed unnecessary or inconvenient. The key detail is not that something was hidden. It is that something appears to have ended. Abruptly, the last documented marble veils emerge around 1768. By 1800, they are rare. By 1850, effectively gone. By 1900, historians attribute surviving examples entirely to extraordinary carving skill, not alternative processes. Modern artisans cannot replicate the exact delicacy without thicker supports. That gap remains, unresolved. The silence, the most unsettling aspect, is not the sculptures themselves. It is the quiet around them. Ask how they were made, and the answer returns to artistry. Ask for intermediate stages, failed attempts documented in structure manuals, and there is little. Ask why the method vanished, and there is no clear event marking its end. It simply stops. When technologies evolve, they typically improve gradually. They are transitional forms, iterations, debate, documentation. This feels different. It feels like a door closing. Perhaps coincidence explains it all. Perhaps genius peaked briefly and could not be sustained. Perhaps economic priorities shifted away from such labor-intensive work. Perhaps modern minimalism simply replaced ornamentation. All reasonable explanations. But when patterns repeat in sculpture, in architecture, in cartography, in documentation gaps, questions accumulate. The veils remain. Marble that behaves like cloth. Stone that appears, in fleeting moments of light, almost translucent. We may be witnessing the highest expression of human carving skill ever achieved. Or we may be standing in the presence of a material understanding that slipped quietly out of record. I cannot answer that definitively. What I can say is this. Once you see the veils, you begin to notice them everywhere. In museums, in cathedrals, in forgotten buildings awaiting demolition. In the silence between official explanations, progress may not be a straight line. Knowledge may not always accumulate. Sometimes it disappears. And sometimes what remains is not the record, but the stone. The folds are still there. The light still passes through them. And the question remains, unresolved. Did we surpass the past, or inherit something we no longer know how to reproduce? Part 4. The coordination problem. There is something else that doesn't sit comfortably inside the exceptional genius explanation. Coordination. The veiled sculptures appear almost simultaneously across different regions of Europe between roughly 1717 and 1768. Italy, Austria, possibly influence extending toward France and Russia, not gradually spreading like a trend, not emerging from a single workshop and slowly radiating outward. They appear synchronized. In conventional art history, techniques spread through guilds, apprenticeships, travel. They are letters, contracts, sketchbooks, technical notes, rivalries, disputes over authorship. But in the case of extreme marble veiling, documentation is thin. We know the names of certain sculptors. We do not know the exact procedural steps they used to push marble to the edge of structural failure without crossing it. No preserved workshop journals detail the trial and error phase. No series of failed veils survive showing the learning curve. The earliest surviving examples are already mature. If this was simply artistic evolution, we would expect developmental artifacts. Instead, we find finish mastery, then silence. Now expand the lens. During the late 1700s and early 1800s, neoclassical architecture emerges almost everywhere at once. Europe, Russia, North America. Government buildings, museums, opera houses, banks, train stations, all sharing proportional harmonics, dome structures, column systems, mathematical symmetries that appear highly coordinated. We are told this was fashion, a revival of Greece and Rome. But when you compare measurements, many of these buildings exceed their supposed inspirations in precision and scale. Load-bearing techniques become increasingly ambitious. Monolithic columns weighing dozens of tons are transported and erected with remarkable consistency. Consider the colonnades of Kazan Cathedral in St. Petersburg. 9 to 6 identical granite columns, each carved from single pieces of stone, aligned in precise geometry, transported, positioned, fluted with uniformity. Patience explains effort. It does not fully explain uniform repetition at scale. To achieve that level of identicality across dozens of monoliths requires not only skill, but system. And systems imply shared knowledge. Part 5. Material behavior. Let's return to the material itself. Marble is crystalline calcium carbonate. Granite is a composite of quartz, feldspar, mica. Limestone is sedimentary. Each has mechanical properties. Each has fracture points. Yet in multiple historical sites, Peru, Egypt, Turkey, Europe, we observe stones shaped with organic curves, tight fits, and minimal visible percussion signatures. There are conventional explanations for each case. Harder stones used as pounders. Copper chisels replaced frequently. Labor forces in the thousands. Extended time frames. All plausible. But when the same surface signature appears across continents and millennia, smoothness suggestive of plastic shaping rather than repeated impact. Curiosity is warranted. Historical texts occasionally reference methods for softening stone. Alchemical tradition spoke of substances capable of rendering mineral temporarily malleable. Plant extracts, acidic compounds, mineral solutions. Most modern scholars interpret these passages symbolically or as misunderstandings of chemistry. That interpretation may be correct. But here's the crucial detail. These references exist in writing. and then they gradually disappear from mainstream curricula during the early 19th century, precisely when educational institutions centralize and standardize knowledge. Alchemy transitions to chemistry. Esoteric processes are reframed or discarded. Libraries reorganize. It is entirely possible that nothing of practical value was lost. It is also possible that certain experimental traditions were simply abandoned because they did not align with emerging scientific frameworks. Abandonment does not require conspiracy. It requires prioritization. Part 6. The Era of Demolition. If advanced material techniques existed in the 18th and 19th centuries, we would expect their finest expressions to survive. Some did. Many did not. Between 1950 and 1970, hundreds of ornate 19th century structures across the United States and Europe were demolished. The justification was modernity, efficiency, economic practicality. The Singer Building in New York, once the tallest building in the world, dismantled voluntarily. The original Pennsylvania station, one of the grandest Beaux-Arts structures ever constructed, demolished for redevelopment. Countless civic halls, train stations, and ornate municipal buildings quietly erased. Obsolete. That word appears repeatedly in archival descriptions. Obsolete despite superior stone carving. Obsolete despite structural longevity. We often assume technological progress is linear, that each generation improves upon the last. But architectural history complicates that assumption. Many late 19th century stone structures demonstrate craftsmanship that modern developers openly admit will be prohibitively expensive or difficult to reproduce today. Cost explains part of it. Changing taste explains part of it. But when demolition coincides with documentation gaps, the question shifts from aesthetics to preservation. Were samples preserved? Were structural techniques exhaustively studied before destruction? In many cases, no. Photographs remain. The buildings do not. Stone evidence vanishes more permanently than paper. Part 7. Cartographic Transitions. Now consider the cartographic anomaly. 18th and early 19th century maps consistently label vast regions of northern Asia as Tartaria or Tartaria. This nomenclature appears across rival European mapmakers: French, British, German, Russian. Then, gradually, the term dissolves. Political reorganization explains much of that. Empires consolidate, borders harden, geographic knowledge improves. But Tartaria becomes, in retrospect, a vague placeholder, a broad designation for territories not yet fully integrated into modern nation-state structures. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of a lost empire erased from history. That interpretation goes beyond documented evidence. But the transitional timing is interesting. The fading of Tartary from maps overlaps with the institutional restructuring of knowledge in Europe and the abrupt disappearance of certain architectural techniques. Correlation is not causation, but patterns deserve attention. Part 8. The Educational Shift. The early 19th century marks a profound shift in how knowledge is categorized. Scientific academies standardize curricula. Alchemy is reclassified as pre-scientific. Mystical or experimental traditions are archived or dismissed. This is widely celebrated as intellectual progress, and in many ways, it was. Modern chemistry, physics, and engineering produce extraordinary advances, but standardization has side effects. Knowledge systems that do not fit emerging frameworks are often abandoned rather than integrated. If a niche material process existed, rarely practiced, poorly understood, difficult to replicate, it could have faded naturally as educational focus narrowed. Not suppressed, not hidden, simply deprioritized. The result, however, would appear identical to deliberate erasure, absence. Part 9. Return to the veil. Stand again before the veiled Christ. Observe the folds. Notice how the marble clings to the lips, the cheekbones, the curve of the torso. Under raking light, subtle compression lines appear beneath the surface, as though something soft had been pressed into something softer. Is that illusion or residue? Modern sculptors argue that such effects can indeed be carved with extraordinary patience. They may be correct, but even they acknowledge the originals possess a delicacy rarely equaled. If the veils were purely carving triumphs, why did no one surpass them? Why no 19th century evolution toward even thinner, even more translucent marble drapery? Why no industrial replication once tools improved? Instead, the technique contracts. then disappears. Part 10. The core question. The most unsettling aspect is not the possibility of a lost empire. It is the possibility of lost material knowledge. Human history is not a perfect upward slope. Civilizations forget. Techniques vanish when economic incentives shift. Wars destroy specialists. Educational reforms marginalize fringe practices. Entire crafts disappear within a generation if transmission breaks. Perhaps that is all we are witnessing. Perhaps the 18th century briefly achieved an apex of stone artistry that required conditions no longer present: patronage, labor systems, economic structures, artistic obsession. And when those conditions changed, the knowledge faded. That explanation requires no conspiracy, but it does require humility. Because if that is true, then progress is not guaranteed. We may not stand at the peak of technical capability. We may stand on layers of forgotten experimentation. Final reflection. Look closely at the marble veil. Light passes through its thinnest edges. Stone behaves, for a moment, like cloth. Whether that effect was achieved through unparalleled carving skill or through material process we no longer practice, the result is the same: a gap between what we assume and what we observe. We assume the past was primitive. The evidence sometimes disagrees. We assume technology accumulates. History sometimes contradicts. The buildings remain where they have not been demolished. The sculptures remain where they have not been hidden in storage. The maps remain, showing names that later vanished. And the silence remains, not a dramatic silence, but a quiet academic shrug. Perhaps everything can be explained conventionally. Perhaps nothing extraordinary occurred. Or perhaps we inherited fragments of a knowledge system that slipped quietly out of transmission during a century of upheaval. I cannot prove suppression. I cannot confirm a lost empire. I can only point to patterns. And once you see them, the veils, the precision stonework, the synchronized architectural bloom and decline, they become difficult to ignore. The question is not whether Tartaria existed as a clearly bounded empire. The question is whether something existed, a network of knowledge, a material science, a coordinated tradition, that left physical evidence but incomplete documentation. We may never know, but the stone remains. And stone, unlike paper, does not lie easily. It simply waits, silent, for someone willing to look at it differently. There is one more detail that often goes unnoticed. When historians encounter something difficult to explain, they usually do one of two things. They either intensify investigation, or they reduce the anomaly to exceptional skill. In the case of the marble veils, the explanation settled on skill. In the case of polygonal stonework, it settled on labor. In the case of synchronized neoclassical expansion, it settled on fashion. Each answer is reasonable in isolation. But when the same pattern appears across multiple disciplines, sculpture, architecture, cartography, material science, and each time the explanation leans toward coincidence or extraordinary individuals, the weight begins to accumulate. Because history rarely moves through isolated miracles. It moves through systems. The 18th century was not a technological backwater. It was a period of global trade, expanding empires, scientific curiosity, and experimentation. Communication networks were growing. Ideas moved faster than we often assume. It is entirely possible that material knowledge, whether chemical, mechanical, or procedural, circulated quietly among specialized groups and then vanished when economic or political structures shifted. Knowledge does not always disappear because someone hides it. Sometimes it disappears because the conditions that sustain it collapse. Guilds dissolve. Patrons die. Wars interrupt transmission. Institutions standardize education. And techniques that are not codified in textbooks simply fade. What remains are artifacts without instruction manuals, stone without context, buildings without blueprints, maps without explanation. And when later generations encounter those artifacts, they reinterpret them through the limits of their own understanding. If we cannot replicate something easily, we assume it was genius. If we cannot trace its documentation, we assume it was luck. If a name disappears from maps, we assume it was an error. But assumptions accumulate, and occasionally they harden into narrative. The term Tartaria may never represent a clearly bounded empire with kings and flags. It may simply represent a transitional period, a placeholder for territories and knowledge systems that were later reorganized under modern identities. The danger is not in believing or disbelieving in a lost empire. The danger is assuming we already know everything about our material past, because a physical record tells a more complicated story. Stone veils thinner than expected. Granite cuts cleaner than anticipated. Architectural precision that rivals or exceeds modern replication. Synchronized emergence. Abrupt disappearance. Demolition of structures before exhaustive study. Educational reform that reclassified entire bodies of experimental tradition. None of these elements alone prove anything extraordinary. Together, they suggest incompleteness. And incompleteness is uncomfortable. It implies that progress may not be linear. It implies that certain peaks of craftsmanship may have required social or intellectual conditions we no longer possess. It implies that forgetting is as much a part of history as invention. Stand once more before the veiled Christ. Notice how the marble seems to hover between solid and fabric. Notice how light grazes the folds and creates the illusion of breath beneath stone. Ask yourself, not whether it is miraculous, but whether we fully understand how it was achieved. Because if we do not, then humility is required. And humility changes how we read the past. We may not have inherited a shattered super-empire. We may have inherited fragments of techniques, material insights that were never fully institutionalized before the world reorganized itself. Or perhaps we are witnessing nothing more than the extraordinary heights of human patience and artistic obsession. Both possibilities are profound, but only one requires us to question the completeness of our historical narrative. The veils remain. The buildings that survived remain. The stones at ancient sites remain. They are not arguing. They are not announcing conspiracy. They are simply present. And presence is powerful. History is often written in ink, but sometimes it is written in granite. The question is not whether something was hidden. The question is whether we stopped looking. Because once you truly see the folds in stone, once you notice a precision that seems to exceed its explanation, it becomes difficult to return to comfortable assumptions. Maybe we are the most advanced civilization in history. Or maybe we are standing among remnants of knowledge that slipped quietly through the cracks of reform, war, and modernization. Maybe nothing was erased. Or maybe what was erased was subtle, not buildings, not statues, but understanding. And understanding is easier to lose than stone. The marble still catches light. The edges still appear translucent. The folds still behave as though gravity once moved through them. We call it mastery. We call it genius. Perhaps it is. But perhaps it is also memory, frozen, waiting, not for belief, not for outrage, just for attention. And that is where the real investigation begins.